talking about the Sea Wolves and the Marines, they ran a lot of patrol PBRs, patrol boat rivers up and down the canals. And one of the places they went was down in a place called Kamau. And the Pelfrey was the military name for the place. Pelfrey was a 2,000-foot runway, and it had, I think, the last 500 to 600 feet were in contested territory. So at any rate, it was all run and operated by the Navy. And got called. They wanted help, gave me the coordinates. We headed that direction. They had several of these patrol boats spread up and down the canal, and they're fighting back and forth. What boat do I land on? They say, the Tango boat. Right, the Tango boat. Pop smoke on it, will you? I didn't know a Tango boat from a Bravo boat or any other kind of boat. So they went ahead and popped the smoke. Okay, I have you coming in. Well, that damn boat, I had control of the boat once I landed a helicopter on it. Where I tilted the rotor, the back end of the boat was going. So at any rate, they loaded them on board, and I pulled myself out of there, and there was no real big problem. Again, luckily, no problem, because the ground people did what they had to do. They suppressed the fire, got the patients on board real quick, and I was able to get out of there. Got to give them credit.
Jack Tragus landed a medevac helicopter on a moving patrol boat in the middle of a firefight on a Vietnamese canal, and didn't even know what kind of boat it was until he was already committed. And I mean, when you hear this story, you'll understand that dust-off pilots in Vietnam had to figure things out on the fly, literally, because nobody had written a manual for half the situations they found themselves in. Tragus flew with the 82nd Medical Detachment in Vietnam, running medevac missions in some of the most challenging environments the war had to offer, from the Mekong Delta's maze of waterways to contested airstrips where the last few hundred feet of runway were in enemy territory. His story is one of those accounts that shows you what it really meant to be a dust-off pilot, the improvisation, the trust in the ground troops, and the strange emptiness of coming home to a country that didn't know what to do with you. And look, before we get too deep into Jack Tragus's experience, I want to mention that I share these veteran stories pretty regularly because I believe they matter. The men who flew these missions, who risked everything to bring wounded soldiers home, their voices deserve to be heard and preserved. So if you're someone who cares about keeping this history alive, maybe consider subscribing so you don't miss these accounts when they come out. All right, back to Tragus. Jack Tragus served as a medevac pilot in Vietnam, flying dust-off missions with the 82nd Medical Detachment. The dust-off crews were the airborne ambulances of the war, flying unarmed Huey helicopters into active combat zones to extract wounded soldiers. The name came from the radio call sign, and it became synonymous with the bravest flying in the entire war. These pilots went in without weapons, relying on speed and skill and the willingness of ground troops to suppress enemy fire long enough to get casualties loaded and get back out. The Geneva Convention protected medical aircraft, at least in theory, which is why they flew unarmed with big red crosses painted on the sides. But the enemy didn't always respect those conventions, and dust-off crews took fire just like any other helicopter in the combat zone. Sometimes being unarmed actually made things worse because you couldn't shoot back. You could only evade and hope your luck held until you cleared the area. The 82nd Medical Detachment was one of several air ambulance units operating throughout Vietnam during the war. These detachments were positioned strategically to provide medevac coverage for American and Allied forces across the entire country. The work was constant and relentless, with multiple missions every single day, each one a potential encounter with enemy fire, each one a chance to save lives or lose your own in the attempt. The crews developed an intense professional pride that transcended all the political debates about the war raging back home. Whatever was happening in the States, whatever the protesters were chanting on college campuses, The dust-off mission was pure and uncomplicated in a way that few other aspects of the war could claim to be. You saved lives. That was it. There was no moral ambiguity about pulling wounded men out of firefights and getting them to surgical hospitals where they had a fighting chance to survive their wounds. To really understand what Jack Tragus and his fellow dust-off pilots faced on a daily basis, you need to understand something about the aircraft they flew and the conditions they operated under. The UH-1 Huey became the iconic helicopter of the Vietnam War, its distinctive sound a constant presence over the jungles and rice paddies and mountains of Southeast Asia. That whoop, whoop, whoop of the rotor blades became the soundtrack of the war, and veterans can still identify it instantly decades later. The Huey was versatile, relatively reliable for its era, and could be configured for multiple different missions including medevac operations. The dust-off Hueys were set up specifically for casualty evacuation, with litter racks installed to carry stretcher patients, and space for a crew chief and medic in the back in addition to the 2 pilots up front. A typical crew was 4 men, pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, crew chief and medic in the cargo area. Each of them had a job to do, and they functioned as a tight-knit team because their lives depended on everyone performing their role. But for all its versatility, the Huey was also vulnerable in combat. It wasn't particularly fast, it wasn't armored in any significant way, and when you were hovering over a landing zone waiting for patients to be loaded onto your aircraft, you were essentially a stationary target for anyone with a rifle, or a rocket-propelled grenade, or even a lucky shot from a pistol. The pilots who flew these missions understood the risks intimately, understood them in their bones. They accepted those risks because the alternative, leaving wounded men to die in the field because it was too dangerous to go in and get them, that was unacceptable. The whole ethos of the dust-off community was built around the idea that you went in when you were called, period. Hot landing zone or cold, day or night, good weather or monsoon. You went because someone needed you. Jack Tragus came into the Army through the aviation pipeline that produced thousands of helicopter pilots during the Vietnam era. The Army's need for aviators was insatiable during those years, and they trained young men quickly and efficiently, taking them from zero flight experience to qualified helicopter pilots in a matter of months. The training was good, rigorous, and comprehensive for what it covered, but nothing in stateside training could fully prepare a pilot for the chaos of actual combat operations. The sound of rounds hitting your aircraft, the sight of tracers arcing toward you, the controlled panic of a hot extraction with wounded men bleeding out in the back while enemy fire raked the landing zone. These things couldn't be simulated. You learned these lessons in real time in Vietnam, and you either adapted to the reality of combat flying or you didn't make it home. There was no middle ground. The area where Jack Tragus operated included the Mekong Delta, which was one of the most unique and challenging combat environments in the entire war. The Delta was a vast expanse of rivers and canals, rice paddies and swamps and marshland stretching from Saigon south to the very tip of Vietnam, where the Mekong River emptied into the South China Sea. This was some of the most fertile agricultural land in all of Southeast Asia, densely populated, crisscrossed by thousands of waterways, ranging from major rivers to narrow canals barely wide enough for a sampan. The Viet Cong had deep roots in this region, having organized and operated there for years before American forces arrived in strength. Many of the local villagers were sympathetic to the communist cause, or at least intimidated into cooperation, and the guerrillas could move among the population like fish swimming in the sea, to use Mao's famous phrase. The terrain itself favored guerrilla warfare, with countless waterways providing routes for movement and supply that were almost impossible to interdict completely. The dense vegetation along the canal banks offered concealment from aerial observation, and the maze-like geography meant that American forces could never really control the region, no matter how many operations they ran. American and South Vietnamese forces tried to dominate the Delta through a combination of ground operations, riverine warfare, and air support. The ground forces would sweep through areas, trying to find and fix the enemy, while the naval forces patrolled the waterways, and the helicopters provided mobility and fire support and medevac capability. It was a complicated, multi-dimensional form of warfare that required coordination between different services and different types of units, all operating in terrain that seemed specifically designed to make their jobs harder. The Navy's brown water forces became a critical element of Delta operations. These were sailors operating small, fast patrol craft on the rivers and canals, engaging Viet Cong forces wherever they found them, and trying to interdict enemy movement along the waterways. The PBRs, Patrol Boat River, became the workhorses of this riverine war. These were fiberglass-hulled boats about 30 feet long, powered by water jet propulsion that let them operate in shallow water, armed with machine guns and sometimes grenade launchers or other weapons. The PBR crews faced incredible danger every time they went out on patrol, moving through narrow canals where ambush could come from either bank at any moment. The enemy would set up positions in the vegetation along the waterway, wait for a patrol to enter the kill zone, and then open up with everything they had. It was a brutal, intimate form of warfare where engagements happened at close range, and the outcome often came down to who reacted faster and shot straighter. The Sea Wolves that Trajas mentions were Navy helicopter gunship units that provided fire support for the riverine forces operating in the Delta. These were UH-1 Hueys modified for the attack role, armed with rockets and machine guns, flown by Navy pilots who worked closely with the PBR crews and other brown water forces. The Sea Wolves would fly cover for patrol boat operations, ready to swoop in and suppress enemy positions when the boats came under fire. They were the cavalry, the quick reaction force that could turn the tide of an engagement by adding their firepower to the fight. The coordination between the patrol boats and the helicopter gunships was critical to survival in the Delta, and the crews from both branches developed a mutual respect born of shared danger and reliance on each other. Into this complex operational environment came the medevac helicopters, the dust-off crews, whose job was to extract the wounded regardless of which service they belonged to or what kind of engagement they'd been in. When someone got hit on a PBR, they needed to get out, just like someone hit in a jungle firefight. The difference was that the extraction point was a boat instead of a landing zone, which created unique challenges that hadn't been anticipated when the medevac doctrine was developed. One of the locations that stands out in Jack Trajas's memory is a place he refers to by its military designation, a location associated with Phu Quoc, with a 2,000-foot runway, where the last 500 or 600 feet extended into contested territory. Just stop and think about what that means for a moment. The runway itself, the actual surface where aircraft took off and landed, partially extended into an area where enemy forces were active and capable of engaging anything that came within range. Every operation at that airstrip carried inherent risk that had nothing to do with the mission itself and everything to do with just being there. The airfield was run and operated by the Vietnamese Navy, adding another layer of complexity to any operation conducted from that location. American pilots working with South Vietnamese forces had to navigate language barriers, different operational procedures, different equipment, and sometimes different levels of training and capability. The alliance between the United States and South Vietnam was essential to the entire war effort. But at the operational level, it wasn't always smooth. Communication could be difficult, coordination could be challenging, and the friction of combined operations added uncertainty to situations that were already dangerous enough. Jack Tragus, and pilots like him, had to adapt to working with various Allied forces, figuring out communication protocols and coordination procedures on the fly because the mission didn't wait for everyone to get perfectly synchronized. You learned to work with whoever was there, however you could make it work, because the alternative was failing the wounded men who needed your help. Now let me tell you about the mission that really stands out in Jack Tragus's memory, the one that encapsulates what it meant to be a dust-off pilot in the Mekong Delta, the mission that shows you just how wild things could get when the conventional rule book went out the window. Tragus got a call for help on the radio. Someone needed medevac, casualties that needed to be extracted from an ongoing engagement. They gave him coordinates, a location somewhere in the canal network of the Delta, and he spooled up his helicopter and headed in that direction. He didn't know exactly what he was flying into, just that someone was hurt and needed his help. That was enough. That was always enough. When Tragus arrived at the coordinates and got a visual on the situation, he found a scene that was pure chaos, the kind of thing that no training had prepared him for, because no one had imagined it would be necessary. There were several patrol boats spread up and down a canal, American Navy vessels engaged in a running firefight with enemy forces on the banks. The boats were maneuvering in the narrow waterway, their guns hammering away at Viet Cong positions in the vegetation, while enemy rounds snapped back across the water. Tracers crisscrossed the air, the distinctive sound of multiple automatic weapons mixing with the thump of heavier guns from the boats. Somewhere in that mess, on one of those boats, were wounded men who needed to get out if they were going to survive their injuries. Jack Tragus was circling overhead in his unarmed medevac helicopter, trying to figure out how exactly he was supposed to accomplish this extraction. Landing zones were supposed to be on solid ground, cleared areas where a helicopter could set down safely while casualties were loaded. This was a moving boat in the middle of a canal with a firefight raging on both banks. Standard procedures didn't exactly cover this scenario. Tragus keyed his radio and asked the obvious question, "What boat do I land on?" Because with multiple boats spread along the canal, all of them engaged with the enemy, he needed to know which one had the casualties, which one he should approach. The answer came back from the radio, "The Tango boat. Land on the Tango boat." Here's the thing that makes this story so authentically human. The detail that shows you Jack Tragus wasn't some superhero, but just a regular pilot doing his job under extraordinary circumstances. He didn't know a Tango boat from a Bravo boat or an Alpha boat or any other kind of boat. He was a helicopter pilot, an Army aviator whose expertise was in rotary wing aircraft. The naval designation system for patrol craft was completely outside his training and experience. Tango boat meant nothing to him, just a collection of syllables coming through his headset while rounds cracked through the air around him. He needed visual identification. He needed to know which boat specifically he was supposed to land on, and the only way to get that was the universal language that every pilot understood, regardless of branch or specialty. "Pop smoke on it, would you, Tragus?" transmitted. Smoke grenades were the standard method for marking positions in Vietnam. You popped a smoke, the colored plume rose into the air, and the pilot could identify the color to confirm he was looking at the right location. It worked on the ground, and apparently it would have to work on a boat, too. Someone on the Tango boat, whatever a Tango boat was, popped a smoke grenade. Colored smoke began billowing up from one of the patrol craft, giving Tragus the visual reference he needed. "Okay, I have you," he radioed. "Coming in." And then Jack Tragus did something that probably wasn't in any flight manual anywhere, something that helicopter pilots hadn't practiced or even conceived of until the Vietnam War made it necessary. He brought his Huey down toward a patrol boat, a moving vessel on a canal in the middle of a firefight, with the intention of landing on it and extracting wounded men while enemy fire continued all around. Just think about the physics of what he was attempting. A helicopter generates an enormous amount of downwash from its rotor, a powerful column of air being forced downward that affects everything beneath the aircraft. On a normal landing zone, that downwash kicks up dust and debris, hence the name dust-off. On water, it creates a visible disturbance, spray and waves radiating outward from the point beneath the rotor. And on a small boat, that downwash becomes a force that affects the vessel's stability and handling, pushing it around in ways the boat crew has to compensate for. The landing surface on a patrol boat was tiny compared to any normal landing zone. These weren't aircraft carriers or even large naval vessels. PBRs were about 30 feet long, with deck space that was mostly occupied by weapon stations, engine covers, and the various equipment necessary for riverine operations. Finding enough flat space to set helicopter skids down was itself a challenge, and that space wasn't stable. The boat was moving with the water, pitching and rolling even in relatively calm conditions, and the current and the rotor wash would make it move even more unpredictably. Add in the chaos of an ongoing firefight, the stress of taking fire while trying to accomplish a precision flying maneuver, the need to make split-second decisions while tracers arced past the cockpit, and you have a situation that would make most pilots hesitate. But hesitation wasn't an option. Those wounded men needed to get out, and the boat was where they were. So Jack Tragus brought his Huey down toward the deck of that patrol boat. He managed the approach, compensating for the movement of the boat and the effects of his own rotor wash, and got his skids onto whatever deck space was available. Once Tragus had his helicopter down on the boat, he discovered another complication that nobody had warned him about, because nobody had ever needed to warn anyone about it before. The helicopter's rotor was now affecting the boat's handling in ways that made normal control impossible for the boat crew. The massive rotor wash, that column of air being forced down by the spinning blades, was pushing against the stern of the boat and causing it to slew around. Tragus describes it vividly. He had control of the boat once he landed the helicopter on it. He was steering it with his rotor. The back end of the boat was going wherever the rotor wash pushed it, and there wasn't anything the boat crew could do about it until the helicopter lifted off again. This was absolutely not something covered in any flight training Jack Tragus had ever received. He was essentially flying his helicopter and steering a patrol boat simultaneously, managing both aircraft and vessel through the aerodynamic effects of his rotor, all while a firefight raged around them and wounded men were being loaded into his cargo bay. This is what combat flying in Vietnam was really like for the dust-off crews. It wasn't clean. It wasn't textbook. It wasn't anything like what training had prepared you for. It was improvisation under fire, figuring out solutions to problems that had never been anticipated, adapting in real time to circumstances that the people who wrote the manuals couldn't have imagined. You did what needed to be done because there was no other option. Failing wasn't acceptable when wounded men were counting on you. The boat crews did their jobs during this insane extraction. They understood what they were asking of the medevac pilot, and they did everything they could to make the mission survivable. They suppressed the enemy fire, laying down enough rounds to keep the Viet Cong heads down while the helicopter was vulnerable and exposed on their deck. They got the wounded men loaded as fast as humanly possible, because everyone involved understood that every second that helicopter sat there was another second where something could go catastrophically wrong. Speed was survival. If this story is resonating with you, if you're finding value in hearing these veteran accounts, I just want to say thanks for sticking with it. Jack Trages and men like him lived through experiences that most of us can't begin to comprehend. And the fact that you're taking time to listen means something real. These aren't just war stories told for entertainment. This is living history, carried by the men who made it. And we're running out of time to record these voices before they're gone forever. If you want to help get these accounts out to more people who care about preserving this history, subscribing and sharing really does make a difference. Every person who hears these stories is helping to keep them alive for future generations. All right, continuing with Jack Trages's experience on that canal. With the wounded loaded and the boat crews giving him the clear signal, Trages pulled power and lifted his helicopter off that patrol boat deck. Up and away from the canal and the firefight, climbing to altitude with wounded men in the back, who now had a chance to live because a helicopter pilot had done something that probably wasn't supposed to be possible. The rotor wash released the boat as the Huey climbed, and the patrol craft could resume normal operations, continuing the engagement with enemy forces on the banks. Behind Trages, the sounds of the firefight faded as he headed for whatever medical facility was receiving casualties that day. Mission complete. Patients extracted. Now get them to the surgeons and get ready for the next call. Jack Trages is modest about the whole thing, as most of these veterans are when they talk about what they did. He gives credit to the boat crews rather than focusing on his own flying. They knew what they were asking me to do, he says, and for the most part, they did their job. I got out on time. Got to give them credit. They suppressed the fire, got the patients on board real quick, and I was able to get out of there. That's how dust-off pilots talk about missions that would make a Hollywood screenwriter hesitate because it would seem too unbelievable for a movie. Just another day at the office, just doing the job, got lucky, no big deal. Luckily, no problem, Trages says, because the ground people did what they had to do. No drama, no self-aggrandizement, just a professional assessment of a mission accomplished through teamwork and skill and a whole lot of improvisation. That patrol boat mission was just one of many that Jack Trages flew during his tour in Vietnam, but it stands out because of how unusual it was, how far outside normal helicopter operations it fell. Most missions didn't require landing on boats. Most missions were extractions from jungle clearings or rice paddy dikes or fire-based landing pads, the standard locations that dust-off crews trained for and expected. But the Delta was different, and operating in support of riverine forces meant adapting to a different kind of warfare than what was happening up in the highlands or around the major American bases. The nature of medevac work meant constant variety, constant challenge, constant exposure to situations that tested your skills and your nerve. One day, you might be pulling wounded soldiers out of a jungle firefight in triple canopy terrain. The next day, you might be evacuating casualties from a village that had been hit by mortar fire. The day after that, you might be landing on a patrol boat on a delta canal because that's where the wounded men happened to be. You never knew what the next mission would bring, and that uncertainty was part of what made the job so demanding. The missions blurred together after a while. Trages probably couldn't give you specific dates and grid coordinates for every pickup he made during his tour. The human mind isn't built to retain that level of detail across hundreds of missions. But certain moments burned themselves into memory with perfect clarity, images and sensations that would never fade no matter how many years passed. The tango boat, the smoke grenade marking the landing spot, the rotor wash pushing the stern around while he fought to keep his aircraft stable, the wounded men being passed up through the cargo door while rounds cracked through the air somewhere nearby, the surge of power as he lifted off and the boat dropped away beneath him. These moments stay with a man forever. The 82nd Medical Detachment that Jack Trages flew with was part of a larger network of medevac units that provided coverage across the entire Vietnam theater of operations. The Army had recognized early in the war that rapid evacuation of casualties was essential for both saving lives and maintaining the morale of the fighting forces. The famous golden hour concept, the understanding that a wounded man's chances of survival increased dramatically if he could reach surgical care within 60 minutes of being wounded, drove the entire organization of the medevac system. Getting casualties from the point of wounding to a hospital capable of treating them became a logistical and operational priority that shaped how resources were allocated throughout the theater. Dust-off helicopters were positioned at airfields and fire bases throughout Vietnam, ready to launch on minimal notice whenever a call came in. The crews worked in shifts, standing by with their aircraft fueled and ready, waiting for the radio call that meant someone, somewhere, needed their help. When that call came, you scrambled. You got your bird in the air, and you headed for the coordinates they gave you, often not knowing exactly what situation you'd find when you arrived. Sometimes it was a cold landing zone, no active enemy contact, just wounded men who needed transport to a hospital. You could land, load patients, and take off without anyone shooting at you. Those were the good missions, the ones where skill mattered more than luck. But sometimes the landing zone was hot, meaning you were flying into active combat, into a situation where enemy forces were still engaged with American troops and would happily add your helicopter to their target list. Hot extractions required coordination with gunships if they were available, required the ground troops to suppress enemy fire while you were exposed and vulnerable, required split-second decisions about approach angles and escape routes, and whether the risk was acceptable given the condition of the wounded. And sometimes, like that mission on the canal, the situation was something nobody had anticipated at all, something that required pure improvisation, because no doctrine existed to guide you. You figured it out or you failed, and failure meant wounded men died. The medevac crews flew day and night in all weather conditions, into every kind of terrain Vietnam had to offer. They flew when the monsoon rains reduced visibility to almost nothing, navigating by instruments and dead reckoning through clouds that seemed to press down from above. They flew when the ceiling was so low they were practically skimming the treetops, following rivers and roads as navigational aids because they couldn't climb high enough to see the landmarks they normally used. They flew into ambushes and hot landing zones and situations that defied any reasonable risk assessment because wounded men were depending on them, and the whole point of being a dust-off pilot was that you went when you were called. That's what the mission demanded, and the men who flew it accepted those demands. Jack Tragus was one of thousands of medevac pilots who served in Vietnam over the course of the war. From the early advisory days through the major buildup and the long years of fighting and the eventual withdrawal, dust-off crews were there, extracting casualties and delivering them to the hospitals that gave them a chance to survive. The statistics are impressive in their aggregate. Hundreds of thousands of casualties evacuated over the course of the war. But statistics can't capture what it was like for the individual crews flying those missions. Each flight was its own story, its own collection of risks and decisions and moments of fear and relief. The cumulative effect of flying these missions day after day, week after week, month after month, for an entire tour of duty was profound in ways that are hard to convey to anyone who hasn't experienced it. Combat stress builds up over time. You can handle one mission, you can handle 10 missions, but each one adds to the weight you're carrying, and there's no way to set that weight down completely until you're out of the combat zone for good. Some men cracked under that accumulated pressure, broke down in ways that ended their effectiveness or their careers. Others developed coping mechanisms, ways of compartmentalizing the fear and the horror that would haunt them for years after they came home. and some, like Jack Tragus, found a way to keep functioning, to keep flying, to keep doing the job right up until their tour was complete and they rotated back to the world. As Jack Tragus's tour in Vietnam wound down toward its end, as his Diaries date approached, and the magic number of days remaining got smaller and smaller, he started thinking about what was waiting for him back in the United States. What he'd heard wasn't particularly encouraging. Stories about the anti-war movement, about protests and demonstrations, about the hostile reception that some returning soldiers were experiencing. These stories had filtered over to Vietnam through letters from home and news coverage, and the scuttlebutt that circulated through any military organization. The soldiers knew what was happening back in the States. They knew that the war they were fighting, the war that demanded everything they had to give, was deeply unpopular with large and vocal segments of American society. Television brought images of the protests right into their awareness. They could see the demonstrations, the crowds of young people their own age chanting against the war, the signs and banners denouncing American involvement in Southeast Asia. And they could hear, through various channels, that some returning veterans were being treated not as soldiers who had served their country, but as villains who deserved contempt for their participation in an unjust war. Jack Tragus had actually encountered protesters at some point before his deployment to Vietnam, so he knew from personal experience that these weren't just stories or exaggerations. They were real, he says simply. They weren't a figment of anybody's imagination. The anti-war movement was a genuine force in American society. Millions of people who opposed the war on moral or strategic or political grounds, and soldiers returning from the combat zone would have to navigate that reality, whether they wanted to or not. Tragus was worried about what he might face when he landed back on American soil. He didn't want to see any protesters, and he's honest and self-aware about why that worried him. "I'm not too sure how I would have reacted," he admits. This was a fear that many returning veterans shared, though not all of them were willing to acknowledge it so openly. You spend a year in combat, wound tight every single day, your nervous system recalibrated for a war zone where threats can come from any direction at any moment. You learn to suppress normal emotional responses, because in combat, you can't afford to feel everything fully. You have to compartmentalize the fear and the grief and the anger just to keep functioning. And then, suddenly, you're back in the world, back in the United States, and some college kid who's never heard a shot fired in anger is in your face calling you a baby killer or a war criminal or spitting on you because they've decided that you're personally responsible for a war that politicians started. The potential for explosive, violent confrontation in that scenario was very real. Many veterans worried about losing control, about all that bottled-up stress and combat-conditioned aggression finding an outlet in exactly the wrong way. Punching a protester might feel satisfying in the moment, but it would ruin your life. Court-martial or criminal charges, everything you'd survived in Vietnam meaning nothing, because you couldn't keep it together for 5 more minutes on American soil. Tragus didn't want that confrontation. He didn't want to test his self-control against someone deliberately trying to provoke him. All he wanted was to get home and see his family, his wife, his young daughter, the normal life he'd been dreaming about and longing for during all those months of flying into firefights and landing on patrol boats. "Just let me get back to them," he was thinking. "Don't put obstacles in my way. Don't make me deal with people who have no conception of what I've been through. Just let me go home." The return route from Vietnam for most American soldiers passed through Oakland, California. Oakland Army Base was the major processing point for troops coming back from Southeast Asia, the place where you officially ended your overseas tour and began the transition back to stateside status. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers passed through Oakland over the years of the war, processed through a system designed to handle high volumes of returning personnel efficiently. From Oakland, soldiers dispersed to various destinations depending on their next assignments or their separation from the service. Some went to other military installations for further duty. Some went through discharge processing and became civilians again. Some, like Jack Tragus, were heading to new assignments that would continue their military careers. The mode of onward travel varied as well, sometimes military aircraft to Air Force bases near your destination, sometimes commercial flights that mixed returning soldiers with ordinary civilian travelers. Tragus isn't entirely certain of the details of his own journey from Oakland to his next destination. It may have been a civilian terminal, he recalls. We weren't coming back as a group. We were just passengers from Vietnam coming home. Individual travelers, each one finding his own way to wherever he was going next. That transition from being part of a military unit to being an individual passenger on a commercial aircraft was jarring in its own way. One day you're surrounded by men who understand exactly what you've experienced because they've been through the same things. Your fellow crew members, your fellow pilots, the other dust-off guys who know what it means to land on a patrol boat in a firefight because they've done their own crazy missions. And the next day you're just another guy at an airport, anonymous, carrying a duffel bag full of memories that nobody around you could possibly comprehend. The woman at the ticket counter doesn't know where you've been. The businessman in the seat next to you doesn't know what you've done. You're surrounded by people living their normal lives, and you're carrying a year of Vietnam inside you with no way to explain it, and no one who would understand even if you tried. The military did try to help with some aspects of the transition. Tragus acknowledges that they did a good job of trying to get us oriented, getting us our tickets, our transportation to our individual homes. The administrative aspects, the paperwork and logistics of moving soldiers from point A to point B, that was handled reasonably well. The Army had decades of experience processing returning troops, and the machinery worked efficiently, even if it wasn't particularly warm or personal. So, that part wasn't so bad, Tragus says, but coming home itself, the actual experience of being back in the United States after a year of combat operations, that was something completely different. It wasn't just about logistics or processing or getting from one place to another. It was about the internal experience, the psychological reality of suddenly being in a world where everything that had defined your existence for the past year was suddenly irrelevant. All of a sudden, there was a letdown, Jack Tragus recalls. You know, you've been wired pretty tight for a year. And all of a sudden you're watching What's My Line on TV? It's just not exactly what's going on there. That image has stayed with me since I first heard Tragus describe it. A man who hours or days earlier was landing helicopters on patrol boats in the middle of firefights, making split-second life and death decisions, operating at the absolute limit of his skills and courage. And now, he's sitting in a living room somewhere in America, watching a television game show where celebrities try to guess what occupation a contestant has. What's my line? People trying to figure out if someone is a baker or a plumber or a traveling salesman, and the audience laughing at the clever questions and the witty responses. The disconnect between those two realities, combat and game shows, was total and complete. There was no bridge between them, no way to integrate one experience with the other. The skills that had kept Tragus alive in Vietnam, the hyper-awareness, the instant threat assessment, the ability to make decisions under fire, none of it applied in the world of What's My Line? He was supposed to just turn all of that off, to become a normal American again, to care about the things normal Americans cared about. But you don't just turn off a year of combat conditioning. You don't just set down the weight you've been carrying. It stays with you, and you have to learn to live with it, even when nothing around you acknowledges that it exists. Certainly wasn't any parades, Jack Tragus says. There wasn't anybody saying, "Whoa, you did good. We're sure glad. Thank you for your service." There was none of that. This was the nearly universal experience of the Vietnam generation. Unlike the men who came home from World War II to ticker-tape parades and genuine national celebration, welcomed as conquering heroes who had saved civilization from fascism, the Vietnam veterans returned to something very different. At best, difference from a society that wanted to move on from an unpopular war. At worst, active hostility from people who saw the returning soldiers as symbols of everything wrong with American policy, legitimate targets for anger and contempt. The country was divided over Vietnam in ways that made simple expressions of gratitude complicated, if not impossible, for many Americans. If you opposed the war, thanking the men who fought it could feel like endorsing the policies you were protesting. If you supported the war, you might be uncomfortable with its direction, with the growing sense that America wasn't winning, that all those sacrifices might be for nothing in the end. Either way, the individual soldiers got caught in the middle. They became visible symbols of a conflict that many Americans just wanted to forget. And the easiest way to forget was to ignore the veterans, to look past them, to change the subject whenever the war came up. The men who had served were left to carry their experiences alone, without the societal recognition and support that previous generations of veterans had received. Jack Tragus has a remarkably balanced perspective on all of this, a nuance that speaks to his character and his ability to see multiple sides of a situation. "I can't say I blame people necessarily," he says about the Americans who didn't welcome returning veterans, "but on the other hand, I did my job. I felt my country ask me to go. I went." That's an incredibly mature and generous attitude from someone who experienced that homecoming firsthand, someone who might have every justification for bitterness and resentment. Tragus understood that the political situation was genuinely complicated, that people's opposition to the war came from real convictions and wasn't simply directed at the soldiers as individuals. But he also understood what he had done and what it had meant. He had answered his country's call. He had served where he was sent. And whatever anyone thought about the war itself, the missions he had flown, the lives he had saved, those things mattered. "I felt that no matter what," Tragus says, "as a dust-off pilot, I did something that many people through the day had the opportunity to live, to have families, to have grandkids that would never have existed without the mission that we performed." There it is, the irreducible truth that Jack Tragus and every dust-off crew member could hold on to, regardless of what the protesters chanted or the politicians said. The medevac missions saved lives, not abstractly, not theoretically, but actually and concretely. Real soldiers, real human beings, who got wounded in combat and would have died without evacuation. They lived because a dust-off helicopter came and got them. Those soldiers went on to recover from their wounds, to return to their families, to live decades more of life. They had children and grandchildren. They built careers and businesses and families. All of that, all those subsequent lives and all the good they contained, happened because Jack Tragus and pilots like him flew into firefights and pulled wounded men out. That's not nothing. That's not something you can dismiss with a wave of the hand because you disagreed with the political decisions that sent those men to Vietnam in the first place. Whatever you think about the war, however you judge the wisdom of American involvement in Southeast Asia, the men who were there and fought there were real, and saving their lives was an unambiguously good thing to do. When Jack Tragus got home, He needed space to decompress, to readjust, to figure out how to be a person in a world that wasn't a combat zone. Other than having time with my wife and my family and my young daughter, he says, just leave me alone. That's what he wanted. Not attention, not recognition, not parades or speeches. Just the space to be with the people he loved without having to explain or justify or defend what he'd done. They spent time with his wife's family in the Lansing, Michigan area, a quiet reunion away from the pressures of explaining Vietnam to people who couldn't understand it. Most people respected our privacy, Trages says. Most family members anyway. That qualification is interesting, suggesting that not everyone gave him the space he needed, that some people wanted to ask questions or make comments that Trages wasn't ready to deal with. But mostly the family understood or at least respected his need for distance. And Trages didn't want to see anybody else. The need for isolation that Trages describes was incredibly common among returning Vietnam veterans, though not everyone could articulate it as clearly as he does. It wasn't antisocial behavior in any clinical sense, it was protective, a form of self-preservation that recognized the impossibility of bridging the gap between combat experience and civilian comprehension. You couldn't explain what you'd been through to people who had no frame of reference for it. The words didn't exist, and even if they did, the listener wouldn't really understand. So why try? Better to stay quiet, to be with the few people who knew you before and could accept you now without demanding explanations. We're getting close to the end of Jack Tragis's story now, and I want to take a moment to thank you for staying with it all the way through. These veteran accounts take time to tell properly. They need that length to convey what these men actually experienced. And the fact that you're still listening means you understand why it matters. If you want to help get these veteran voices out to more people, subscribing and sharing really does make a difference. This is living history, and every person who hears these stories is helping to preserve them for future generations who should know what was asked of these men and what they gave. All right, wrapping up Jack Tragis's story. Unlike many Vietnam veterans who couldn't wait to get out of the military once their obligation was complete, who wanted to put as much distance as possible between themselves and everything associated with the war, Jack Tragis made a different choice. He decided to stay in. When they asked him if he wanted to continue his military career, his answer was yes. He ended up serving 26 years total, a full career that took him far beyond that single tour in Vietnam. They're the post-war transformation of the military and into whatever duties and assignments came his way over the following decades. The military became his professional life, and the skills and judgment he'd developed in combat served him well through all those years of continued service. After his Vietnam tour, Tragis went to the career course at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. Fort Sam was the Army's primary medical training installation, the place where medical officers and other medical personnel received advanced professional education and developed the skills necessary for higher-level responsibilities. The career course was designed to prepare officers for increased scope and complexity in their roles, building on their experience and giving them the knowledge they'd need as they advanced in rank. But Jack Tragis wasn't content to just sit in classrooms and absorb lectures while he was at Fort Sam Houston. He was still a pilot, still a medevac aviator at heart, and he looked for ways to keep flying even while completing his formal education. While he wasn't in scheduled class sessions, Tragis volunteered to help fly medevac. The patients coming back from Vietnam, the wounded soldiers being evacuated to stateside hospitals for continued treatment and rehabilitation, they were arriving at Kelly Air Force Base near San Antonio. Someone had to transport them from Kelly to the military and VA medical facilities in the area, and Tragis volunteered for that duty. He would help fly wounded soldiers from Kelly to Brooke Army Medical Center, one of the military's premier hospitals, or to the VA hospital in Houston. He did this for a significant portion of his 9 months at Fort Sam Houston, maybe 5 or 6 months of flying medevac missions, he recalls, just helping out, continuing the work that had defined his combat tour. Think about what that choice represents. Tragus had just completed a year of flying dust-off missions in Vietnam, a year of landing on patrol boats and extracting casualties under fire, a year of accumulated stress and danger. He could have spent his career course doing nothing but studying, staying on the ground, giving his nerves a break from the constant demands of aviation. Nobody would have faulted him for taking it easy. But instead he volunteered to keep flying, to keep transporting wounded soldiers, to keep doing the mission that mattered to him. Some of that was practical, certainly. Pilots need flight hours to maintain proficiency, and volunteering for medevac missions was a way to stay current while also contributing something useful. But some of it was clearly something deeper, a commitment to the work itself, a recognition that wounded soldiers still needed help and that he was in a position to provide it. The patients arriving at Kelly weren't strangers in any meaningful sense. They were fellow soldiers, men who had been through what Tragus had been through, wounded in a war that Tragus had seen from the air. Helping them get to the hospitals where they would receive treatment was a continuation of the same mission he'd flown in Vietnam. The context was different: stateside instead of combat zone, safe airspace instead of hot landing zones. But the fundamental work was the same: get the wounded to the doctors, give them a chance to heal. That dedication to continued service, that willingness to keep contributing even when he didn't have to, it speaks to the kind of man Jack Tragus was, and presumably still is. He didn't view his obligation as ending when his combat tour ended. He didn't see military service as something to get through and escape from at the first opportunity. He committed to a career, 26 years of continued service, and he made that commitment with his eyes open about what it would require. The transition from Vietnam-era service to the post-Vietnam military was its own challenge. After the American withdrawal from Southeast Asia, the military went through a difficult period of readjustment and reorientation. The draft ended, and the all-volunteer force began, which changed the fundamental nature of military recruitment and retention. Budgets were cut as the nation tried to put the war behind it. The prestige of military service was at a low point, with fewer Americans choosing to serve, and those who did sometimes looked at with suspicion or pity rather than respect. The men who stayed in uniform during those years, who maintained their commitment despite the lack of public support and appreciation, they kept the military functioning through some of its most challenging peacetime years. Jack Tragus was one of those men. He continued to serve, continued to contribute, continued to matter, even when the country around him seemed to have moved on from everything the military represented. When Tragus finally retired after 26 years, the military was a very different institution than the one he'd joined. The Vietnam era was history by then, studied in academies and written about in books, but no longer the lived experience of most serving soldiers. New conflicts had come and gone. Technology had transformed warfare in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to the pilots of the Huey era. But the fundamental values that Tragus had embodied throughout his career, the dedication to mission, the willingness to put yourself at risk for others, the professionalism under pressure, those endured. They were passed on to new generations of soldiers and aviators, part of the institutional memory that connected the present force to everyone who had served before. Asset Tragus carried those values from his first day in Vietnam to his last day in uniform, and presumably into his civilian life afterward. The skills he developed landing on patrol boats in firefights, the judgment he exercised under conditions of extreme stress, the character that led him to volunteer for medevac missions when he didn't have to. All of that was shaped in Vietnam and carried forward through the rest of his career. What do you take away from Jack Tragis's story after hearing all of it? There's the dramatic stuff, certainly. Landing a helicopter on a moving patrol boat in the middle of a firefight is objectively extraordinary, the kind of thing that makes for gripping cinema. But there's also the quieter stuff, which might be more important in terms of understanding who these men really were. The way Tragis talks about the boat crews who did their jobs and made the extraction possible. The credit he gives to others rather than focusing on his own skill and courage. The matter-of-fact way he describes missions that would make most people's palms sweat just hearing about them. The decision to keep serving, to volunteer for medevac missions even when he was supposed to be focusing on his education, to commit to a 26-year career instead of getting out at the first opportunity. The nuanced and generous way he thinks about the protesters and the difficult homecoming, declining to hold grudges even when grudges might be justified. Jack Tragis represents something essential about military service that's easy to overlook if you only focus on the combat heroics. Yes, he did extraordinary things under fire. Landing on that Tango boat in a canal firefight is remarkable by any standard. But what's equally remarkable, maybe more remarkable, is the quiet professionalism that characterized his entire career. The team player mentality, the willingness to serve year after year through good assignments and bad, through public appreciation and public indifference, because serving was what he did. The Vietnam generation of veterans served during the most unpopular war in American history. They went where they were sent, did what they were ordered to do, and came home to a nation that couldn't decide whether to ignore them or blame them. Many of them, like Jack Tragis, kept serving anyway. They didn't need parades. They didn't need thanks. They had their own knowledge of what they'd done and what it had meant. And that was enough. That's character. That's integrity. That's something worthy of recognition and respect, regardless of what you think about the war itself. The dust-off crews of Vietnam saved tens of thousands of lives over the course of the conflict. They flew unarmed into hot landing zones, relying on speed and skill and the cooperation of ground forces to get in and out alive. They landed on patrol boats and in rice paddies and on mountain clearings, wherever the wounded happened to be, because getting to the wounded was the mission, and the mission was sacred. Many of the dust-off pilots and crew members didn't come home. Their names are on that black granite wall in Washington, mixed in with the infantrymen and the artillerymen and all the other soldiers whose lives were given in Vietnam. The ones who did come home carried experiences that would mark them forever, memories that would wake them in the night, images that would flash behind their eyes at unexpected moments for the rest of their lives. Jack Tragis carries those memories: the Tango boat, the smoke grenade rising from the deck, the rotor wash pushing the stern around while he fought to keep his aircraft stable on that tiny landing surface, the wounded men being loaded while the firefight crackled on the canal banks, the strange emptiness of coming home to "What's my line?" and no parades, the quiet decision to keep serving, to keep flying, to keep mattering for 26 years after that war was over. That's his story, and it's worth telling, it's worth hearing, it's worth preserving for future generations who will never know what it was like, but who should at least understand that men like Jack Tragis were there, doing impossible things because impossible things needed to be done. Saving lives because saving lives was the job. The Mekong Delta is quiet now, mostly. The canals where patrol boats once fought running battles with Viet Cong forces are used for commerce and fishing and the ordinary business of people living their lives in peace. The war ended almost 50 years ago, and the wounds have healed, at least on the surface, at least enough for the two countries to have normal relations, and for tourists to visit the places where soldiers once died. But the men who were there, the ones still living, they carry the Delta and all the rest of it with them still. Jack Tragus flew with the 82nd Medical Detachment in Vietnam. He landed helicopters on patrol boats because that's where the wounded were, and getting them out was what he was there to do. He came home to a country that didn't know how to thank him, and he kept serving anyway. 26 more years of dedication to a profession that had already asked everything of him, and that he had given everything to without complaint. That's the story of Jack Tragus, a dust-off pilot, a career soldier, a man who did extraordinary things, and then talked about them like they were just part of the job. The quiet ones are often the most impressive, when you really listen to what they have to say. This was the account of Jack Tragus, 82nd Medical Detachment Vietnam veteran, who landed on a patrol boat in a firefight because that's where the mission took him, and who spent 26 years in uniform because service was who he was and what he believed in. Thanks for listening.